I'd like to thank the Brain Foundation for inviting me to participate in this, and welcome everybody to the afternoon session for the novel therapeutics portion of Synchrony 2020. I'm John Rodakis. I'm a parent of a child with autism. I have a background in medical venture capital. Today I'm going to talk to you about breakthroughs in autism, something I think we're all interested in. I recognize it's a pretty diverse audience here. There's parents trying to learn more about what's on the horizon. There's people with deep backgrounds in the pharmaceutical and biotech area. I hopefully put together a little something for everybody here. You know, as I was putting this presentation together, I had this song that kind of kept going through my head. It's an obscure 80s pop song that summed up my feelings, but perhaps some of you have heard of it, but the future's so bright, I gotta wear shades. I think, you know, this is a message of optimism, and hopefully you guys will come away feeling that way when I'm done. Just briefly, I run N of One Autism Research Foundation. Our goal is to catalyze, fund, and communicate breakthroughs in autism research. It's really to give every child the best chance at an independent life. And the way we do that is we take a venture capital approach by seeding academic researchers and facilitating and supporting commercialization efforts. And we focus on three emerging and what I believe are underfunded areas: cell metabolism, microbiome, and the immune system. So I thought I'd begin by seeing if I could get the entire autism community, or at least everybody on this conference, to agree on one thing, which is not always the easiest thing in autism. But no matter who I talk to, when I tell people what I do, I always hear some version of the same thing. You know, we're all waiting for that big breakthrough. I'm waiting for the thing I can give my kid. I'm waiting for the thing I can give my patients. We're all waiting for the same thing. We all want the same thing, a breakthrough. And that led me to think about, well, what is a breakthrough? And I spent some time trying to really define it. And I'll be honest, I didn't end up where I thought I was going to. But here's the definition I came up with, at least for autism. It's an actionable insight that can create a significant improvement for a large portion of the ASD population, and that is accessible to all. So let's break that down just a little bit. I've highlighted some of the important words, but actionable. You know, a theory is not enough. And when I started this, I thought, oh, a breakthrough is a treatment, but I don't think so. I think a breakthrough is an insight that can then enable or lead to a treatment or a prevention strategy. And to really deserve the title of breakthrough, it has to be a significant improvement. And what do I mean by that? It has to create a major improvement in the core symptoms, and preferably something that creates the possibility of an independent life where there wasn't one before. It needs to work on a large portion of the autism population. I picked 25%. I mean, that number is certainly debatable. Smaller subgroups are okay if you can identify them ahead of time. I mean, if something helps 3 to 5%, but we don't know in advance which 3 to 5%, you know, that may or may not be a breakthrough. But it was this last point here that really, I think, was the most surprising to me as I thought about it. It has to be accessible. That means anybody can get it and anyone can afford it. And for anybody to be able to afford it, now we're talking about it has to be insurance reimbursable, which means it has to go through the FDA process. And this is what drives so much of the work and the cost around taking a breakthrough and turning it into something for the community. So I want to talk a little bit about the drug development process. And I know for some of you, you live in this world and could probably teach me about it. But for the families that are waiting for the breakthroughs, you know, we really have to talk about what does it take. We focus a lot on the basic research side of it. You know, the researcher, the university-based researcher who comes up with the big idea. And then that idea gets tested typically in animals, and we call that preclinical work. But then it's got to go through this process before the FDA says, you know, this is both safe and effective. And most people have heard the terms phase 1, which is really about safety, and phase 3, which is about proving out efficacy versus a placebo control. Phase 2 has gotten a little gray over the years. It used to be about dose finding. People are using it for all kinds of things now. But that process is all geared towards making something commercially available. Now, if you look down at these little curves, these represent the cost associated with each of these phases. And what you see is that the costs become enormous, even in a field like autism, once you're talking about phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And these are costs that are unable to be borne by NIH or nonprofits or individual investors. These are the early clinical trial stages are backed by typically either angel investors or venture capitalists, but ultimately it's pharmaceutical companies and the public markets that fund these. And so you could really think of this process as falling into two kind of distinct categories. There's the front end, which is about discovery, and this is where it all starts. But then there's this important back end, which is what makes it accessible, development. And they both need each other. You know, it came as a surprise. A lot of pharma companies don't do a lot of basic research. They rely on the university research to help inform them what is something that could make a viable commercial product. And, you know, similarly, in early stage investigators and university researchers can't do the full drug development process. So we at N of One, and also like the Brain Foundation, we work in this early stage where we work to try to facilitate these insights. There's two takeaways after spending a career in both medical venture capital, but also now having run an autism nonprofit. And these aren't completely obvious to the outside that I thought I would share, particularly with families. The first is there's a big difference between an investigator-led trial and a commercially sponsored trial. So investigator-led trials, I mean, these are, you know, examples in the ASD world would be, you know, Dr. Navio's Suraman trial or Dr. Adams' FMT trial. And these are typically led by an academic researcher. And they're good for a proof of concept, but in many cases, the data isn't even usable for an FDA drug submission. Then there's commercially sponsored trials, and these are led by biotech and pharmaceutical companies. And they're designed to meet the rigorous requirements of the FDA, and they tend to be very, very expensive. And so, you know, a simple way of thinking about it is investigator-led trials give us hope, but commercially sponsored trials make something accessible. The other interesting takeaway that really comes home if you're on the front end of this curve is the importance of patents. You know, I think there are people out there who think that, you know, if an investigator or researcher files a patent, you know, oh, they're being selfish or they're going for the money. And really nothing could be further from the truth. It is the patent that enables the business model. And if there's no patent, there's no protectable business. And if there's no protectable business, there's no investment case, and ultimately there will be no accessible treatments. So, you know, real simple, no patent, no drug. So, you know, we should all be very supportive of the patenting process. So going back to the front end of that curve, that basic research, what is it that drives the breakthroughs there and the pace of breakthroughs? And I came up with this formula, which says, you know, it's a function of the amount of funding times what gets funded. And historically in autism, you know, the funding was, you know, fairly steady. I'm thinking sort of 2000, 2015. But what got funded really fell into a fairly narrow category. It was kind of this genetics first paradigm. And that fell to relatively few researchers. And for that time period, you know, we really don't have any breakthroughs to show for that time period. Now, in the past 5 years or so, this has really started to change. There's been some increase in funding, and a lot of that is as a result of the entrance of commercial entities and biotech companies really coming into the field to help support research. But more importantly, it hasn't been the increase in funding, it's been the broadening of what gets funded. We're funding other areas like the microbiome, and that you'll be hearing about companies that are involved with later on today. And, you know, what follows from that is more researchers. And, you know, if we look at the pipeline right now, we have anywhere from 2 to 4 therapeutics right now that could meet that breakthrough definition that we came up with, but only time will tell if they make it all the way there. ideally this would be even more funding, highly diversified, lots of research, lots of researchers, and my prediction is we'd see a lot more breakthroughs in autism. So I started N of 1 in 2014, and as a parent, we were told there's nothing that can be done. There's no treatments. We were handed a list of ABA providers. And, I went to clinicaltrials.gov and tried to understand, what were real breakthroughs that were on the way. And there really just was nothing. There was nothing to have hope in. Now, this is just 5-6 years later. I'd like to contrast that to today, where this is what the breakthrough pipeline in my mind looks like today. And apologies, there's probably some things that aren't on this list that should be. I just put a few kind of the well-known examples, but we've got FMT and Suramin and Richard Fry's folinic acid work. And it's not on here, but it should be the CMAT, which is in phase 3s. We've got a lot to be excited about potentially in the pipeline. And some of these are moving from the investigator-led session to the commercially sponsored phase of development. And you might say, well, it's just a coincidence, more time, we have more breakthroughs, but I don't think so. Because if you look at this little key I put down here in the corner, the fields that these breakthroughs are coming in, the microbiome and cell metabolism, these weren't fields that were being well researched in that kind of prior historical period. And, we don't really have anything on the immune side right now, but I just think that's a function of where we are with the research. The immune side is a really tough critter, but I predict we'll have breakthroughs there. So what's held us back? What's held us back in autism? Well, in that historical period, as I'd mentioned, there was this historical view that autism is genetic, or primarily genetic, and that the behaviors that we saw, arose from, irreversible brain organization or wiring. And it's not that people weren't trying to make breakthroughs and trying to leverage that information, but if you think about that, if it's genetic and it's irreversible brain organization, the implication is there's just really not much that can be done. And what falls out of that is a notion of acceptance or resignation, and maybe even a lack of urgency. Now, if I think about where we are today, the emerging view is that multiple systems are involved, including beyond just genetics in the brain, but the microbiome, the immune system, cell metabolism, and that these systems are amenable to treatment. And what we've seen from some of the early research trials is hints that really major improvements are possible. What does that do? What does that create? Well, it creates a sense of hope, a new hope, and I think it also creates a sense of urgency, to do something. I mean, think about cancer for a second. When a child gets cancer, everybody comes together to do something about it. The community, the doctors, the medical system, I mean, even celebrities. Why is that? It's because, we know what's possible. We've seen it. We believe it. And it would be unacceptable to do anything else. That's where I think we are. I think we're on the verge of that in autism. Shortly after founding N of 1, I wrote in the Huffington Post that I believe we're on the verge of a paradigm shift in autism. And, the dreaded question for every parent, are we there yet? Well, if you ask me, are we there yet? I mean, I think it's remarkable, but I think we are. I think we are, this is what it feels like. I think we are now in the paradigm shift. The change is happening, and, it's a pretty exciting time. It can give you goosebumps if you let it. I think what's the tipping point? What accelerates it? Well, I think when a severe child that's in an autism trial, is no longer severe, or maybe even no longer, fits the criteria for autism, then I think that's the real tipping point. And then it leads to, articles that start getting written in the most scientific and mainstream media, kind of like what's happening with chronic fatigue syndrome right now, which is undergoing its own paradigm shift, where there was an old view that's now being replaced by a new view. And that hopefully leads to more research and becoming highly diversified. So, you know, in sum, there's reasons to be optimistic. I think the future is bright, but it's in our hands. It's fragile, and so I hope that, you know, you'll take something away, something good away from this, and an optimistic feeling, and try to do something. But if you remember nothing else from this presentation, just remember patents are good, research diversification is good. And thanks much.